turn me back on. Now you've seen it from another source. You don't have to just believe what I told you this morning. Now, we live with this over there all the time. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories of how God rescued me out of situations like this. So, but what I want you to understand, these snakes move so fast that if you blink, they can have you inside of that time of that blink. That's what happened to Crispo. Now I'm going to tell you the story of Crispo. Crispo was my interpreter. He was out hunting wild boar, wild pigs, if you want to put it that way, so that we could have meat for our orphans when I first went over there. This was in 1997. He walked into 8-foot elephant grass. There was 2 other men with him. They go into this grass, and they were setting up rope snares. We're not allowed to have guns in Mozambique. It is a gun-controlled nation. Only the cops and the military and of course, the banditos have guns. So we didn't have any guns to kill the wild pigs, so we had to catch them with a circle rope on the ground that was strung from a tree that's bent over to catch them. When they trigger it, it snaps up and it catches them by a leg and holds them until the hunter can go and get them out of the snare. Well, as he was reaching for a snare that had been sprung but there was nothing in it, a 7-foot black mamba goes whoop and stands up right beside him and hits him on the back of the hand with both fangs. None of the 3 men saw the snake until it hit his hand. That's how fast they are. So he gets bit. All 3 guys run for their lives because a mad mamba, as you saw in that film, if it bites, if one person upsets him, he's going to take out everything that moves in the area. So that's why you don't want to upset him. That's why the guy didn't shoot him. If he missed, he was toast. So, you know, that's why he didn't have a shotgun. He had a single bullet type rifle. Okay, so Crispo runs. Now the worst thing you can do when you get snake bit is to run, because it pumps the poison into your bloodstream super fast, and of course the poison reacts a lot faster. Normally people live 20 to 30 minutes after a snake bite, depending on how big you are. The bigger you are, the slower you die. That's why it took my donkey almost an hour to die when he was hit by a mamba. But a small child will die in 15, 20 minutes easy. Okay, so Crispo and them ran. By the time he ran the 150 yards to get out of the grass and onto the dirt road, there was a log sitting there, and he was already losing function of his legs just in a couple of seconds. So he gets out there, he sits down on this log, and one of the guys jumps on a bicycle and races the 1 mile uphill to my mud hut where I was living. And I had just driven in from another trip, and so when this guy comes in with his bicycle, he just drops the bicycle over here. I'm trying to open my front door, and he says, "Crispo, snake bit." And I just went, oh Jesus, not him. Anybody, you know, but not him, because he was my interpreter. 7 languages this man spoke, and he was in charge of our entire orphan program. If I lost him, the whole program was going to go belly up, because I had nobody else that knew the government paperwork. So I start praying, and I said, God, I don't know what it's going to take, but we're going to need a miracle right here. So I jumped in my truck, drove down the 1 mile down the hill to where he was sitting, and we drive on the left-hand side of the road in Africa, so our steering wheel is on the right. So my passenger sits over here to me. So I drove up, put the truck up right next to him on the log. He had already lost most of the function of his arms and legs, but we were able to stand him up, and he could stand, but he couldn't take a step. His tongue was already so swollen. It had only been 15 minutes. His tongue was swollen so that he could not speak. It was starting to be paralyzed. So we lifted him up, put him in the passenger side of the truck, slammed the door. I jumped in the other side, and I twirled that truck around, and I started driving out of there, going, Crispo, I know you can hear me. So I know you can't speak, but I said, if you will start thanking Jesus for your miracle, because my brother, if we don't get one in another 15 minutes, you're going to be dead. And I will start praying. And I started rebuking the spirit of death. I commanded life into his body, all in the name of Jesus. And I stood on Mark 16:18 that says no poison can come against us in the name of Jesus. I did everything spiritually I need to do, because as an RN, I felt totally helpless. I could do nothing medically for him. Even if you have an antivenom, and only zoos keep it, you must administer it within 4 minutes of the bite for it to be effective. So it wouldn't, there was no supernatural, there was no medicine given that could do anything for him. Okay, it all had to be supernatural. So as I'm driving down the road, I'm listening at him, and I'm going, you know, breathe, Crispo, breathe, because the last thing that happens is the poison gets into your diaphragm. If you've had biology, you know that the diaphragm controls your lungs. If that muscle doesn't pull your lungs down, then you can't breathe. And the victims of a mama bite suffocate, totally aware. They cannot open their eyelids, they cannot speak, but they can hear. So one thing the poison doesn't affect. So you suffocate hearing everything going on around you. So as I continued to pray, Crispo was over there going, and then he gurgled and took his last breath, and that was it. His body relaxed as he died, and he just slid down into the floorboard until his knees hit the dash, and then his body was stuck there. I got so mad. I said, in the name of Jesus, I command life into you, and I rebuke the spirit of death. That man sat straight up when I said that, and turned and looked at me and said, I feel better. I said, take a deep breath. He goes, ah. He said, yeah, that's better. And he had been dead several minutes. His arm was so swollen from the bite that it was swollen up to his shoulder. He could not bend his elbow. He could not bend his fingers or his wrist. It was stuck just like this. And that was still that way. But yet he was alive. So I was very near a clinic nearby, and so I slid that truck right up to the stairs of that clinic. And the police chief came running because he knows that Mama Brenda doesn't, that's what they call me over there, doesn't drive that way. I want you to know that before I can even get out of the truck and rush around to the other side, Crispo had opened the door with his left hand, because it was his right hand that was bit, and he stepped out, and he's doing this. He's just hanging on with the one hand. He's hanging onto the door, weaving. Now 5 minutes prior, he'd been dead. So I'm now watching a dead man walking, okay? This guy was alive. He steps up the 4 steps into the clinic, sits down on the bed, and he starts telling the male nurse what had happened. And I told the male nurse, I said, you know, God is taking care of the poison. All I want you to do is give him a penicillin injection, because I'm just concerned about infection. I'm thinking like a nurse. I'm going, duh. If God can take care of the poison, he can take care of any infection that might be started also. But I was thinking like a nurse. And so this guy took one look at me and he says, lady, this man's going to die. He says, we don't waste our precious penicillin, because they had very little of it, on a dead man. So for 30 minutes, this guy and I argued, and I'm very persistent. My mother calls it bullheadedness, but I call it persistence. So I argued with him, and 30 minutes later, he finally gave Crispo the injection, because just to shut me up and get me out of there. So he gave him the shot, and now it's getting to be dark. But the Lord had spoken to me, and he said, you will take him to Lashinga. Now, Lashinga is the town 4 hours over a really rough road where you just have to crawl through all the holes in the trenches, and you never want to do it at night, because at night with the headlights you can't see the depth of the holes, so you don't know how deep you're going. You can break an axle real easy on your truck. So I just said, Lord, okay, if you want me to take him to Lashinga, then I'm going to need some help here. I had to cross a 90-meter, almost 100 yards to you guys, bridge where the logs weren't tied down. So when you cross the bridge, all the logs start rolling with you. And if you stop, boom, you go through the bridge. I'd gone through it 4 times. It took 10 men each time with boards and all these jacks to get the truck out. So the one thing I did, I said, Lord, okay, then you just make sure those logs are in the right place, because I didn't have time to get out and check the bridge to make sure there was no gaps that I would fall through. So I just drove straight across that bridge, didn't have one bit of trouble, and that was a miracle in itself. I got to Lashinga at 8 o'clock that night. Crispo slept most of the way. He gets out of the truck as we get there, and he says, look at my arm. And all that swelling from here to here was completely gone. His arm was back to normal. As an intensive care nurse who took care of many rattlesnakes and copperhead bites when I was working here in the United States, I can tell you that kind of swelling takes a minimum of 3 days to go down, maybe even longer, not 3 hours. So I knew we were seeing this rapid progression of healing on him. So we go into the emergency room, and I didn't understand why we were sent to the emergency room of Lashinga, because Crispo didn't need it. But the guy who was on duty that night did. He was a Russian atheist physician, sent there by the Russian government to take care of people, and somebody somewhere must have been praying for him. Because we told him a testimony that night that he couldn't refute. The man got so angry, so mad, that he spit on the floor, threw his pen down, and stomped out of the room after we told him what had happened to Crispo. Because his first question when he saw the swollen hand and the fang marks was, well, what time did this happen? And I said, oh, 3 p.m. this afternoon. What? He jumps back and he says, there's no way this guy could be alive 5 hours later. And then we told him the story again, and that's when he got mad and spit on the floor and walked out. He comes back 10 minutes later, gives Crispo an injection of something, I don't know what it was because he wouldn't tell me. And he says, well, go home. I guess you're going to live. And so we went next door to the YWAM base, Youth with a Mission, and stayed there for the night because it was now after 10 p.m. The next morning we get up at dawn, which is about before 6 o'clock, around 5 o'clock in the morning, and all that was left of his bite was the 2 fang marks and a little ring of swelling that a 50-cent piece would have covered. And he was fine. But I want you to know those fangs marks stayed on his hand for 30 days, and that's very unusual. They should have healed long before that and gone, but just the marks stayed. And people came from all over that state to see the first man who ever lived from a mamba bite without medical intervention. Guidepost magazine, it's a huge Christian testimony magazine, picked up the story and ran it worldwide. 3 million people suddenly found out who Orphans Unlimited was, and that's what helped put us on the map, where everybody sort of had an idea what we were doing in Mozambique. But I want to tell you the end of the story. That next morning, when we got home to our mission station, his family had his funeral laid out, waiting for me to bring the body back, because nobody had ever lived. And so when he steps out of the truck, 50 people went, ah! And took off in 50 directions. Because they thought they were seeing a ghost. They're very superstitious people. And like I said, nobody's ever lived, so they didn't expect to see him stand up out of the truck. And we had no communication. There was no telephones, no radios, no way to communicate, so nobody knew he was alive. So after he got everybody settled down, he's really a prankster. So the next morning, he jumps on his motorbike, and he rides into town where that clinic was, where that guy told him he was a dead man. And that guy literally wet his pants and ran when he saw Crispo, because he was so terrified that he'd seen a man, that he was seeing a ghost. Well, Crispo walked very strongly with the Lord for the next 2 years, but sad to say, he threw God's gift back in his face. 2 years after the bite, he started drinking alcohol, and then he started sleeping around with a couple of women that were not his wife, and he picked up AIDS. So he died in 2003 in that same hospital where he gave testimony. So missionaries found him. They knew who he was, so they contacted me and said that that Crispo had repented on his deathbed and died a few hours later after repenting for what he had done. So don't expect God to rescue you if you decide to walk back into sin and throw away the precious gift of life that he gave you. It's really, really a sad thing to see this happen. So that's just reality, guys. God's not going to, if you mock him, he's not going to help you. And Crispo knew what he was doing. Okay? So that's the first story I wanted to tell. I want to open it up. We only have about 15 minutes, but I do want to give you a chance. But I can tell one more story, but do you have any questions that you want to ask? Does anybody have any great questions that they need answers to? Yes. The mama that bit Crispo? It was approximately 7 feet according to the men because it stood up to about this high. That's how we have an idea of how long it was. Yes. Are those type of snakes here? No. They only live in Africa, but they live all over Africa. And they live in the trees. The only difference is the ones that live in the trees are green, and that's the one that struck at me in the story I told you this morning. That was a green mamba. The black ones live on the ground, but they're not really black. That's what fools people. It's their mouth that's black. They're actually a grayish black.